We're going to talk now about a geography to which the Chinese are trying to export much of which we've just been hearing about. Whether it's the authoritarianism and indeed totalitarianism, or whether it's their socialism, communism, whatever you wish to call it, with Chinese characteristics. It is part and parcel of what is being done with this so-called Belt and Road Initiative of Xi Jinping. And I met the other day, thanks to our friend Faith McDonald, with Akol Nyok Akol Dok from South Sudan, who is working hard to try to help his country overcome the effects of jihadism and imperialism from Sudan, Khartoum, but also much of what is being enabled now by the Chinese Communist Party. Akol happens, among other qualities, to have been Mr. Africa International 2016. So we have a handsome specimen here, as well as a leader of the new South Sudan. Akol, please come on up.
Okay, you guys hear me? Okay, thank you for the introduction. As you said, my name is Akol Nyok Akol Dok. I am a graduate of Iowa State University, and I currently live in South Sudan, where I do sort of policy consultant and different work with the business and public sector. Africa. When you think of China, you don't necessarily think of Africa. When you think of United States and Africa, Africa is largely neglected. But there's different Africa that the world doesn't see. The Africa you see may be an Africa of poverty, an Africa of destruction, but there's an Africa of the future. So the future is Africa. Africa will account for more than 54% of the 2.4 billion global population growth in the coming decades. And the UN predicts that between 2015 and 2030, Africa will add 1.3 billion people, doubling its current population. On top of that, Africa remains largely underdeveloped. So its resources, its natural resources, capabilities are all up for grabs. And this is what China is doing. In 2018, President Xi Jinping invited all African heads of state to China, and known as the Beijing Summit Forum on China-African Cooperation. And at this summit, Xi Jinping promised billions of US dollars, up to $100 billion, to support African nations' developmental needs. These needs include infrastructure, economic development, loans. But the catch is that these opportunities have to be done by Chinese companies. The example I give is that my country is currently engaged in a deal with the Chinese, whereas if they're going to build a road about 200 kilometers, and the Chinese will be given 30,000 barrels of oil per day. But the condition is that they have to use a Chinese company, Chinese bank, the Chinese bring in all the manpower, and what do? We get a mediocre road. We don't get training, we don't get capacity, and on top of that, this road is going to collapse and we'll be in debt. So, why is this important? What the Chinese are dominating Africa, and how they're dominating Africa is because the U.S. and Western nations approach. The Chinese play to the narrative that we as the Chinese, we're not like the Westerns, we're not like the Americans, we're not going to intervene into your politics, we're not going to sanction you, we're not going to do this, we're going to work with you, we're going to see you as partners. And so they sell the narrative to African leaders that if you go to the United States, they won't give you money to build roads, to build schools. They'll accuse you of being dictators, human rights abusers, they'll sanction you guys, and we're here. And there's even examples I give where there's some South Sudanese and companies, friends of mine, who say, hey, I want to purchase American equipment to do business in South Sudan. But because there's economic sanction, I have to go to China. So if you want to buy a new rig is about $15 million. So if I reached out to an American company and said, hey, I want to buy a rig so I can start drilling oil in South Sudan and counter the Chinese, I'll be restricted. But what do? I go to Beijing. So this foreign policy approach is dangerous because what the United States is doing. Yes, there are issues in Africa, but the United States should seek to become partners with Africa to counter China. Because what's happening now is China is offering African nations debts because nobody's knocking at the door except African nation. You're an African president, and your people, they need roads, they need infrastructure, they need hospitals, they want development. And you go to the British, you go to the United States, and They tell you that you have bad human rights records, you need to do this, you need to do that. You don't want to hear that. So what do? You go to China, you go to Beijing, and Beijing says, of course, we'll give you whatever you want to give you. What do you need? Well, I want to build a railroad, such as what's happening in Kenya. They built a railroad from Nairobi to Mombasa port, and they financed it through the Chinese Exim Bank. And these loans are predatory loans. Now, China has seized the international airport of Zambia's capital, Lusaka. China has seized the National Electricity Company. China is even on pace to seize the port of Mombasa because of loans. Why is this important? The Belt and Road Initiative that you hear is actually a way to debt trap African nations. And when they debt trap these nations, they seize their assets. So when you do a Belt and Road Initiative, and you go to 54 African countries and you say, we're going to build you roads, railroads, and infrastructure, we'll give you debts. These could have no choice. And you know for sure that some of these people cannot pay these debts. What's going to happen? China essentially is going to be controlling Africa. And when the U.S. turns its eyes, it's going to be too late because these African nations have signed these agreements. What Africa needs essentially is economic development institution. And it cannot get it from China. Africans, they don't go to China. Me, as an African, I spent time in the United States. I see the values of America and how these values have made America transform and made the West transform. But I don't see a lot of Africans go living in China. You don't find a lot of Africans speaking Chinese. But you find a lot of Africans speaking English. So the recommendation is that the United States needs to do a full review on its policy in Africa and consider China as a threat. China is truly a threat. As we speak right now, in South Sudan, you guys have noticed, the Chinese are building the road. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs building in our country is built by the Chinese. And in the building, you have a flag of China and a flag of South Sudan. This is our Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And if you've been to Juba, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is right opposite to the United States Embassy. So you can kind of see the juxtaposition of that. Our president has created a China desk in the office of the president in order to develop relationships. The Chinese are very active in Africa in developing relationships. The Chinese are constantly giving out scholarships, phony scholarships. Many of these students are promised master's degree, bachelor's degree, but they don't get the necessary training that they need. And when they come back to South Sudan or come back to Africa, who's controlling the economy? It's the Chinese. Do you think a Chinese is going to send a Chinese back to China and employ an African? Of course not. And when they come back, as we speak in South Sudan, there are oil field workers who don't know English but only speak Chinese in South Sudan. So when a South Sudanese gets training in China and spends 5 years and comes back and says, I'm ready to work, the Chinese say, well, he's not qualified enough. Why? Because he doesn't speak Chinese. So what is happening is that the Chinese are just having a heyday in Africa, and something needs to be done about it. And this thing is very destructive. So what we want to do is a review of this, and let's see what are ways that the U.S. could partner with countries in Africa to promote economic development and institutions and counter China. Thank you.
Question? Sasha.
Well, I think I can speak.
No, they can't hear you.
Questions that actually involved in a few cases 10 years ago. African unions complained that the Chinese companies in Africa first only in the beginning only hired the workers from China, and they put the workers in the compound and not allowing them to contact African workers. And are they hiring African workers now?
No, on limited scale. And most of the African workers that are hired is through push from the government. But the Chinese themselves, they don't hire African workers. To the point where they bring cooks, drivers, menial labor staff from China to Africa to do some of the work.
This is colonialism.
Yeah, it's colonialism.
Thank you, Akol. Thank you very much.